Imagine turning on your radio in 1975 and hearing a voice slide effortlessly between English and Spanish, capturing the hearts of listeners from California to New York. The singer, a Mexican-American crooner whose life story included picking crops under a merciless Texas sun and serving time in a notorious Louisiana prison. That year, before the Next Teardrop Falls crowned him a pioneer, the first Latino performer to reach #1 on both the country and pop charts at the same time. His name was Freddy Fender, but his journey to stardom was paved with hardship, resilience, and a profound sense of cultural duality. Born Baldemar Garza Huerta in 1937 in the border town of San Benito, Texas, he was the child of migrant workers who labored through scorching heat for a meager wage. Few could have predicted that this shy boy would one day fill concert halls and television screens. His success story would prove that neither economic adversity nor racial barriers could contain an exceptional talent. But as triumphant as his climb would be, the descent would be just as dramatic, marked by personal battles and an industry that often failed to understand him. Baldemar's earliest memories were rooted in the dusty fields of South Texas. His family trudged from one farm to another, picking cotton and vegetables, the radio providing their only escape. Surrounded by both Texan country and traditional Mexican music, he found an intriguing blend of styles that resonated deeply in his young mind. At dawn, it was Hank Williams on the airwaves. By dusk, it was ranchera tunes drifting from a neighbor's yard. Even as a child, Baldemar sensed he lived between two worlds, neither fully accepted as American nor purely Mexican.
I have left for you behind.
It was his mother who recognized his musical potential and saved up enough money to buy him a second-hand guitar. The instrument was battered, yet it sounded like a revelation to him. He started by mimicking the country riffs he heard on the radio, then tried his hand at Mexican ballads that spoke to his heritage. Quickly, it became clear that he wasn't just learning music, he was forging a style of his own, a bilingual tapestry of sounds that reflected the very essence of the Texas-Mexico border. By 15, Baldemar was performing at local bars, weddings, and community gatherings. His friends teased him, dubbing him El Bebop Kid for his rock and roll covers sung in Spanish. The name stuck in local circles, but it was overshadowed by an even bigger change. He adopted the stage name Freddy Fender, inspired by the brand name emblazoned on the guitar he adored. In truth, the name symbolized something else, a promise to bridge the gap between Hispanic roots and mainstream American music.
Well, if you lose me, oh yes, you lose a good thing.
Yet music was not the only path calling him. Like many teenagers who felt restless and out of place, he faced the pressures of everyday survival. Eventually, he dropped out of high school. For a while, he wandered, sometimes performing in small joints, sometimes working odd jobs. Then came a detour. He enlisted in the Marine Corps. Even while in uniform, music was never far from his mind. He performed for fellow Marines, delivering impromptu sets that married rockabilly riffs with Spanish flourishes. It was an early sign of the eclectic style he would later bring to the masses. After his military service, Freddy returned to the Southwest music scene, determined to make a name for himself. He found gigs wherever he could, often in rough bars that paid little but gave him a stage to refine his craft. Louisiana became a second home, its cultural gumbo resonating with his Tex-Mex roots. He sang in English, Spanish, or both, depending on who was in the crowd. It was a risky approach. Many club owners felt uncertain about booking a bilingual act, but for the audiences, his ability to switch languages so effortlessly only made him more captivating. In the early 1960s, he recorded a batch of Spanish-language singles that flirted with rock and roll. Local radio stations in Texas and Louisiana picked them up, expanding his fan base beyond the Mexican-American community. Critics and promoters began to sense that something special was brewing. Here was a Latino performer who wasn't afraid to infuse country ballads with Latin rhythms, or to reinterpret rock tunes with a hint of ranchera flair. The term crossover wasn't widely used then, but Freddy Fender was quietly laying its foundation. But fame and legal trouble found him in the same breath. A minor drug charge landed him in the Louisiana State Penitentiary, Angla, a place infamous for its harsh conditions. This might have spelled the end for some rising artists, but for Freddy, it became another chapter that shaped his music. In the grueling environment of prison, he penned songs reflecting on lost love, regret, and the yearning for freedom. These themes would later form the emotional backbone of his hits, resonating with anyone who had ever felt trapped by poverty, by racism, by their own mistakes. Released from prison, Freddy returned to Texas, older, wiser, and more determined than ever to share his voice with the world. Yet opportunities for bilingual, genre-blending artists remained slim. American country radio had never truly embraced a performer who sprinkled Spanish into a ballad, and the Latin stations often found his country undertones too foreign. But he refused to compromise. Instead, he showcased his uniqueness at every local venue that would take him, waiting for the one break that could catapult him into national consciousness. That break finally arrived in 1974, when Huey P. Moe, a record producer known for spotting unconventional talent, heard Freddy sing in a small South Texas club. Moe was immediately captivated by the raw passion in Freddy's voice, an instrument capable of turning heartbreak into beauty, whether in English or Spanish. Convinced that the music world was ready for something different, Moe pushed Freddy to record a track called Before the Next Teardrop Falls. It was a straightforward country ballad, but Moe insisted on adding Spanish lyrics to give it an edge. Major labels scoffed at the idea. A bilingual country song? It sounded like a recipe for commercial disaster. Yet Moe persisted, and Freddy poured his soul into the recording. When the record finally hit the airwaves, it shocked everyone by soaring to the top of both country and pop charts. Suddenly, Freddy Fender was a household name, and the music industry couldn't ignore what he represented. A bridge between cultures, a testament to the vast potential of bilingual artistry. Riding the momentum, Freddy re-released an earlier composition he had begun in Angola prison, Wasted Days and Wasted Nights. The track became another blockbuster hit. Television appearances, Grand Ole Opry invitations, and radio interviews followed in a whirlwind. For a time, it was as though the entire nation was singing along in two languages. Fans who had never stepped foot in Texas began embracing a style that proudly wore its Mexican influence on its sleeve. From 1975 to 1977, Freddy notched several more hits, among them Secret Love, You'll Lose a Good Thing, and Living It Down. Each showcased that distinctive, sorrow-tinged voice and the fearless blending of country chords with Latin inflections. Critics marveled at how he could alternate effortlessly between a Southern drawl and a Spanish serenade. The country music establishment, long resistant to cross-cultural fusions, found itself confronted by the undeniable success of an artist who refused to be confined by labels. His concerts grew in scale and diversity. It wasn't unusual to see cowboy hats mingling with sombreros in the audience, reflecting a cultural unity that country music hadn't typically embraced. For aspiring Latino performers, Freddy Fender's success signaled a glimmer of hope. Here was a man who hadn't toned down his heritage, yet was filling large venues and dominating radio playlists once reserved exclusively for Anglo artists. Behind the bright lights, however, the pressures were immense. With a foot in the country world and another in Latin music, Freddy navigated an industry not yet equipped to handle true crossover performers. Record executives tried to mold him into something more universally acceptable, while promoters leaned on his Mexican identity whenever they wanted to appeal to a specific demographic. The very bilingualism that had made him a star now complicated radio rotation and marketing strategies. Moreover, his personal demons began to surface. The trauma of his incarceration, the relentless touring schedule, and the weight of being a Latino trailblazer in a predominantly white industry drove him to seek solace in alcohol. At first, it was a means to take the edge off, but as the demands on him escalated, so did his dependency. Shows remained lively on most nights, but there were troubling instances when his voice faltered, overshadowed by his struggles. By the late 1970s, the unstoppable rocket of Freddy Fender's career started sputtering. Newer trends in country music were emerging, and executives cast him aside in favor of fresher faces. The hits dwindled, radio stations gravitated to pop country hybrids that excluded the Spanish that had propelled him to fame. Some nights, he still packed large halls, but others found him playing smaller clubs, forced to rely on the same bilingual charm that had once been his golden ticket. Discrimination also lingered, sometimes brazen, often hidden behind polite smiles. There were venues that invited him only to boast about a Hispanic headliner, while others hesitated unless they needed to diversify their lineup. Even within the music industry, unsolicited advice flowed in. Perhaps drop the Spanish verses, adopt a more country-sounding name, maybe even hide his prison history. For a man who had prided himself on authenticity, these suggestions cut deeply. His personal life mirrored this professional instability. With success came financial temptations, and managerial decisions that once seemed promising turned sour. Tax issues piled up. Family dynamics became strained, particularly when touring swallowed up months at a time. The lavish spending sprees of his peak years spiraled into debt once the record sales no longer raked in massive profits. The cycle of brief recoveries followed by deeper relapses took a toll on both his health and his reputation. Yet the fire of his talent never completely died out. Even in dingy clubs, on nights when he battled hangovers or a failing voice, there were fleeting moments of brilliance, glimpses of the performer who had once taken the country by storm. Loyal fans in the Mexican-American community continued to show up, remembering how his achievements had validated their own identities. In their eyes, he was more than a country star. He was a cultural hero who had dared to stand at the intersection of two musical traditions. As the 1980s wore on, the tension between Freddie's bilingual roots and the mainstream industry grew more pronounced. Radio stations couldn't decide which category to place him in. Labels saw him as either too Latin for country or too country for Latin. It became a textbook example of how rigidly the market had been segmented, and Freddie found himself squeezed out of both sides. Marketing budgets dried up, and tours became a shadow of their former glory. Images from those years reveal a man visibly worn by struggle. The flamboyant outfits were sometimes replaced by simpler attire, reflecting tighter finances. Writers and journalists who once clamored for interviews now either overlooked him or relegated him to nostalgia pieces. Titles like "Whatever Happened to Freddy Fender" cropped up in music magazines, painting a picture of an artist past his prime. Still, he pressed on. Sometimes he'd pick up a guitar in his living room, strumming chords that reminded him why he fell in love with music in the first place. He toyed with new songs, yet found it hard to recapture that early magic in recording studios that were only half intested in producing his work. His voice carried years of heartbreak and survival, but the business side of music was less forgiving. If it wasn't for it was during a modest gig at a roadside bar in the late 1980s, far from the glamour of national television, that fate intervened. Doug Somm, a figure in the Texas music scene, stopped by to watch Freddie perform. Despite everything he'd been through, Freddie's voice was still spellbinding. Somm immediately dialed up two other legends of Tex-Mex music, Flaco Jimenez and Augie Myers, and proposed they join forces with Freddy Fender to form a new group. They called themselves the Texas Tornadoes, and their formation was like lightning striking the same spot twice. This was no ordinary band. Each member brought a slice of Texas musical heritage. Somm's eclectic rock country fusion, Jimenez's accordion virtuosity steeped in ponche and koto traditions, Myers's signature Tex-Mex keyboards, and of course, Freddy Fender's bilingual crooning that had once conquered America. Together they were a cultural explosion, forging a sound that defied simple classification. The Texas Tornadoes' debut album took the music world by surprise. Tracks like Hey Baby, Que Paso, and Who Were You Thinking Of bounced onto radio playlists, bridging classic country channels, rock stations, and even Latin Femish broadcasts. Critics applauded their raw authenticity and raved about a new era of musical fusion. For Freddie, it was a revival he never anticipated. For after years in the wilderness, he was back in the spotlight, only now the spotlight felt more genuine, more celebratory of his borderland identity. Their success didn't just benefit Freddy Fender, it highlighted the rich tapestry of Tex-Mex music for audiences worldwide. Concerts sold out in places that previously had little exposure to conjunto or ranchera styles. Fans from entirely different cultural backgrounds found themselves dancing to accordion-led riffs and singing along to Spanish choruses. The band won a Grammy, bringing long-overdue recognition to a style that had been overshadowed by mainstream pop and rock for decades. The camaraderie of the Texas Tornadoes offered Freddie a renewed sense of belonging. No longer did he stand alone as the bilingual country star. He was part of a collective that celebrated everything he'd once been told to minimize. That solidarity buoyed him through relapses and personal crises, reminding him that the very qualities once seen as career obstacles were in fact his greatest assets. Emboldened by this second act, Freddie also reignited his solo work. His voice, seasoned by triumph and tragedy, resonated even more powerfully on new tracks he released in the early 1990s. Music journalists began to revisit his earlier albums, praising them as pioneering milestones in the evolution of multicultural American music. The once-forgotten icon was now recognized as a trailblazer who had opened the door for countless Latino artists in genres once off-limits to them. But life had another test in store. As the 1990s gave way to the new millennium, Freddy Fender's health began to deteriorate. The first serious blow came when he was diagnosed with hepatitis C, likely a lingering consequence of his earlier struggles. Still, he pressed on, undergoing grueling treatments in between recording sessions and live performances. Fans noticed he had less energy on stage, but his voice, when he could summon it, remained as soul-stirring as ever. Then came news that his kidneys were failing. The cycles of dialysis became part of his weekly regimen, and family members offered heartfelt support. In a remarkable display of devotion, his daughter Marla stepped forward as a kidney donor, a move that granted him more precious time to focus on what he loved most, making music. The transplant was successful, but soon after, Freddie learned that his liver was also failing, necessitating a second transplant. Even as these medical challenges mounted, Freddie used his platform to advocate for organ donation. He gave interviews, spoke at community events, and openly discussed his condition, hoping to inspire others to consider giving the gift of life. His candor shattered cultural taboos in some Hispanic communities around discussing serious illness, transforming his personal battle into a public service mission. The music industry rallied in his support, hosting benefit concerts that drew established artists and newcomers alike. Performers across genres acknowledged their debt to Freddy Fender. Younger Latino singers spoke openly about how his bilingual hits had emboldened them to sing in both English and Spanish without apology. In those final years, he might have felt physically frail, but professionally and spiritually, he stood stronger than ever, buoyed by a legacy that was finally receiving its due. In 2006, yet another dire diagnosis emerged: lung cancer. This time, the burden was immense. Although he faced the prognosis with the same grit he'd shown his entire life, it was evident that the disease had advanced significantly. When asked about his career and accomplishments, he deflected grandiose praise, focusing instead on the barriers he had broken, the cultures he had united, and the people he had inspired. On October 14, 2006, Freddy Fender passed away, leaving a void in American music that will never truly be filled. His funeral in San Benito drew thousands, fans, fellow musicians, and migrant workers who saw in his rise a reflection of their own dreams. The tributes poured in from around the world, highlighting not just a chart-topping vocalist, but a true visionary who had dared to stand proudly with one foot in Mexican tradition and the other in American country. Today, when a Latino artist steps onto the stage at the Grand Ole Opry, or when a bilingual single cracks the country charts, the echoes of Freddy Fender's trailblazing achievements reverberate. He took the rigid walls separating musical genres and cultural identities and poked wide openings in them, reminding everyone that authenticity is the key ingredient that turns a song into a universal anthem. In modern country and rock scenes, you can hear hints of his influence. Acts like Los Lonely Boys, The Mavericks, and even genre-hopping crossover artists may not explicitly name-check Freddy Fender, but his spirit underpins their stylistic freedom. Each time you hear a phrase in Spanish seamlessly woven into a country melody, you're witnessing the reverberations of a revolution Freddy helped ignite. A museum in San Benito now stands as a tribute to the local boy who proved that dreams aren't limited by geography or poverty. Exhibits showcase his stage outfits, his gold records, and that early guitar bearing the familiar Fender logo. Yet the most compelling exhibit isn't in a glass case at all. It's the ongoing conversation about identity, music, and language that he sparked. In border towns, dance halls, and modern recording studios, young artists continue experimenting with blending traditions, just as he did. Ultimately, Freddy Fender's greatest legacy isn't measured in chart positions or awards, though he garnered plenty. It lies in the doors he kicked open, doors that were once firmly shut to artists who came from bicultural backgrounds. He showed us all that sometimes the most moving music comes from those unafraid to inhabit multiple worlds at once. So the next time you hear a soulful ballad slip into Spanish halfway through, remember the man who sang about wasted days yet gave the world so many nights worth remembering. Freddy Fender, an artist who proved that true music knows no borders, and neither should we.